Today, we continue our series of interviews with John Holfel with a two-part interview on the Inner Alpha Group of banks. Now, this banking arm of the British Empire has been used as a juggernaut to destroy the sovereignty of our nation and other nations as well. Now, it hasn't just been 40 years of poor economic decision-making, which has brought us to the point of the collapse of the states and municipalities across our nation, brought us to the point of not being able to produce enough food around the world, and leading to the uprisings, the mass strike here in our nation and abroad. But this has been a result of an intentional policy by the British Empire to undermine the sovereignty of our nation. This is what led to the takedown, the repeal of Glass-Steagall. This is what led to the destruction of the fixed standard of exchange in 1971, which created the environment in which the Inner Alpha Group could operate. Essentially, what had happened is not only was the British Empire able to destroy the sovereignty of the United States, but also created the conditions by which we were induced to do that ourselves. So here's the first half of that interview, and make sure to tune into this website on Thursday at 1 p.m. for Mr. LaRouche's international webcast. Hi, this is Dennis Mason. Joining me in the studio today is John Holfel, and we want to continue the discussion that we've been posting on this site around some of the aspects of the economic breakdown which haven't necessarily been covered by the FCIC report in the text. They did what they were assigned to do in terms of creating a government report that could be relied on to see what brought us to this point right now where we have the mass strike. It's clear to everybody around not just the United States but the world that this economic system is not functioning. It doesn't take care of the people and is disintegrating out from underneath us. So today we wanted to cover the founding of, well, not necessarily founding of, but the actions of what has become known as the Inter Alpha Group of banks, which was established in 1971, shortly after the abolishment of the fixed exchange rate. And the bubbles which resulted from this grouping, this arm of the British Empire, which have served to destroy the United States. You didn't just have random bubbles as cycles of an economic system, but that this grouping, this arm of the British monetarist empire, seeks to destroy the sovereignty of the nation state using finances as a means of warfare. So that's...
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, if you take it from the end of World War II, actually, I mean, the fight against the British Empire, the United States, goes back to our founding and before we actually formed our nation. So this has been going on for a long time. And then after the Civil War, excuse me, we had this outbreak of the American system in which we were spreading progress all around the world. And in particular, we were spreading railroads into the interiors of the continents of the United States, Europe.
Yeah, Germany picked up on this, Russia picked up on this, and that threatened the control by the British Empire, the monetarist empire, of the sea lanes, which is their point, their chokehold on the ability of sovereign nations to be able to trade amongst one another.
Yeah, it was a direct threat to the maritime empire because the British Empire, which is a continuation basically of the Roman Empire through Venice, is a maritime empire. The control of the seas, the control of sea routes and trading and ports, and the financing of trade and that sort of thing. This is what the empire has historically used as its power base. So when you start opening up the interiors via railroad, which are actually more efficient in moving goods than sea power in many respects, you're changing the political map of the world. So the British went nuts. So you had a whole series of things: the overthrow of Bismarck, the Russian Revolution, World War I, the fascist movements in between World War I and World War II, where they tried to destroy nation states and create a global fascist empire. And then you had World War II. Now, the problem with World War II is that the British created Hitler, but Hitler turned on them. So they needed the United States, which they were trying desperately to destroy, to bail them out. And we did. We saved them. But we had FDR, and FDR told Winston Churchill, the British Empire is finished after the war. We didn't fight this war to save the British Empire, which sent Churchill into apoplexy. All right, so that was the scene coming out of World War II. Then as soon as FDR died, the Brits started going after the United States to try to take it down. The plan was, we were the world's leading industrial power. We were stronger than all of Europe. So that had to be changed. So that means two things. That means, one, you start taking down the U.S. industrial power, and two, you start building up Europe. And the idea was to build up Europe as a financial power. So you had a number of events, the Treaty of Rome, the beginning of the creation of the European community, which was a way to build up Europe as a base from which to attack the United States.
Is this a precursor, kind of that's setting the foundation for what we know today as the Eurozone, that type of
yes,
of supranational sort of control governance over the nations?
A European-wide fascist government. Yeah. And so it was in this, as part of this move, then the Inner Alpha Group was created in 1971. Now, the Inner Alpha Group was created by a group of relatively small European banks, which represented the fondi, the private funds of the oligarchs of the empire. You know, the fondi, because it's an Italian term meaning funds, but it comes from Venice. These are the Venetians at work.
The old family banking.
Yeah. Of which things like the Rothschilds are a representative. Rothschild, Warburgs, Lazard here in the United States, in France, in Britain. These are representatives of this. But the Inner Alpha Group was basically, the nucleus of it was these old family funds which were used to create, they were going to unify Europe from the standpoint of creating, so you could create giant banks in Europe than to take on the United States. So they began consolidating in Europe using these old family funds. But they understood that in order to build a financial empire of the size that they needed, their own money, as much as it was not enough. So they had to bring in other people's money. They had to find a way to leverage money belonging to others. So the Inner Alpha Group's assignment was to do just that, to start creating markets, to create what we know today as globalization. Right. So you had the group founded in 1971. In 1973, you had the Egyptian-Israeli war, which led to the oil boycott against the United States, which created the spot market. This was the basis for the creation of the spot market in oil, which then shot oil prices up and started creating this pool of Eurodollars that could then be used by the Inner Alpha Group for their own purposes and for speculation against the United States. And this was with the oil hoax of 1979, the Iranian crisis. Then this took another giant step forward, so that you see that this oil speculation, which we have today, now with oil, $100 a barrel.
Right.
This is a continuation of that same process. This is a giant pool of money which is being looted from nations around the world in order to fund this Inner Alpha operation.
As well as other things like the whole BAE and Al Yamama scandal, I guess is one way to put it, in terms of funding different aspects of terrorism funding, things like the capability to pull off 9/11, funding the capability to have different military groups to then cause chaos in different regions in order to maintain the ability to have governance over different regions. Also, it seems to be part of that.
Yeah, and another major element of this is dope.
Yeah.
The global dope trade, which the British Empire controls, which British banks and the inter-alpha banks control. And you see this, this goes back to the days of the opium wars against China, in which the British would force Indian opium on China at the point of a gun. And that's never really changed. You can see that today in the way in which the British are protecting the opium trade in Afghanistan with the help of President Obama. So, and if you shut down the drug trade, it would basically collapse the global banking system because they need that money very much. And if you look at the spread, there's no accident that the spread of European banks largely into Mexico is what made it possible for the drug trade to start taking that nation over. It wouldn't be possible without the banking networks. That where the drug trade flourishes, the banking network is always set up first, because otherwise the drug trade would choke on its own cash. So banking, the bankers are an integral part of the drug trade. And the people who, if you follow the money instead of the dope, money always goes back to the boardrooms, in the city of London and in Wall Street and places like that. So the dope trade, the funding of terrorism and other operations, we've seen this in the case of one of the founding members of the Inter-Alpha group, Bacco Ambrosiano of Italy, was very much tied to the P2 Freemasonic Lodge, which was involved in running terrorism in Italy, which was had a bunch of old Nazis and Mussolini black shirt people, that they were deploying for various purposes, and they were running drugs and running guns. And, this is just pure crime, organized crime. And that gives you some insight into what this Inter-Alpha group is. But as it spread, it was spreading in Europe as Europe was consolidating, the European Economic Community, the European Union, finally the Euro. In the United States, you had a similar process of consolidation of the financial side of things. You had in 1968, you had the Bilderberger meeting in Canada, where this idea of the world company was put forward, that you'd have the cartels, corporate cartels, replacing nation states as the rulers of the world. That the bankers would run the cartels and the cartels would run the world. And this was explicitly against the nation state. It was explicitly Malthusian, that you can't trust nations to manage resources because they tend to think that the resources in their borders belong to them. And they don't. They belong to the empire.
Well, it seems that at that point in time, 68, this is before the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system.
Yeah.
As much as Glass-Steagall in the United States, which took till 1999 to officially take down, at that point in time, because that type of mentality where you have international corporations, what have you, determining global finance, you can't do that with a fixed exchange rate system. You can't. It seems like you can't wage monetary warfare in the same way until you uncouple the currencies from anything having to do with physical reality.
Yeah, you can't. And the idea was to turn, since the empire has always been a monetary empire, they want to shed all controls on money. They want to be able to do whatever they want with money. And when you have a fixed exchange rate, which Roosevelt put into place explicitly to stop them from being able to do that, that's a real obstacle to them. Now, it was the ending of the exchange rate the fixed exchange rate, which made the modern derivatives market possible. Because the derivatives market largely started out as currency speculation. This is what George Soros got so rich doing, currency speculation, supposedly in 1992, the man who broke the pound. But using these giant pools of money as a battering ram against nations. Now, he supposedly attacked the British pound and, broke the Bank of England, they say. But, as I've said before, the proof that he didn't break the Bank of England is that he's still alive.
Yeah. And also as part of the move to take down the fixed exchange rate system in the first place, they actually had to sink the pound in order to create the conditions. The British Empire aren't concerned about defending their people if it's in their geopolitical interests to get something done to be able to expand their monetary empire. They'll easily sacrifice their people or their own currency. It's
Yeah. Well, I guess the question then is, what do you mean by their people? Because to the British Empire, their people are the oligarchs, not the people of England or the people of what you would think of as the nation of Great Britain or the currency of that nation. That those are expendable. That this is a parasite which moved from Rome to Byzantium to Venice and to Holland and then to England. And it moves around. It's not loyal to any particular place. And it will move again if necessary. So it's perfectly willing to throw the nation of Great Britain under the bus. If it's convenient for them. So yeah, they'll sink the pound. They don't care what it does to the people of England because they don't care about the people of England. And so you have this currency warfare. And if you look at what happened in Ibero-America as an example of how this works, you had nation after nation which are trying to emulate the United States, borrowed money for infrastructure projects to make their economies more efficient, to try to become industrial powers in their own right, to build up their nation to make it self-sufficient. And the bankers came in and lent them money. And then but they lent them money in dollars. And then after they were on the hook for all these loans, then the bankers came in, and because there was no fixed exchange rates, they were able to run currency warfare against them and forced them to devalue their currency against the dollar. So they were devaluing their own currency, yet they still had to pay their debts in dollars. So it took more and more pesos, for example, to pay off $1's worth of debt than ever before. So the amount that they were having to pay for their debt service was going up and up and up to the point where they couldn't meet their debt service. So then the IMF would come in and say, well, okay, you're a deadbeat. You've got to stop all these projects, these expensive infrastructure projects. We can't afford them. You've got to concentrate on paying us. The result was, after several cycles of this, that these nations had paid back more than they ever originally borrowed. Their infrastructure projects were dead, and they were further in debt than ever before, and had the IMF and the international banks more and more involved in running their countries. They lost control of their countries to this process. And this is possible because the fixed exchange rate was taken down. And then you had the rise of another part of the derivatives market, which is the biggest part now, which is interest rate derivatives, which are basically bets on bonds, bets on debt. And this is the real heart of the Venetian debt farming, that you get everybody hooked on debt and then you can control them by their debt. You look at the way today in which, say, this idiot Bill Gross of PIMCO or PIMCO, the world's largest bond fund, is always telling the United States government what they should do. Well, who the hell is he? He's a representative of the oligarchy. He's not an oligarch, but he's their mouthpiece. You know, we don't care what he thinks.
Well, that's exactly what one aspect of what's happening right now around the states is that you have the states which are indebted. They can't generate their own credit to get out of the debt themselves, and so being technically in debt on paper for as a result of being swindled over the last decades into rolling over these kinds of debt streams in order to seem more prosperous and have the money flow to get to the teachers, the firefighters, and this kind of thing. Now that that has completely collapsed, you have these same sorts of folks coming into the states saying, well, you got to pay up, you got to pay up, you got to pay up. What does that mean? That means cutting police, cutting fire, cutting state services, cutting Medicare, Medicaid rather. And the people aren't tolerating that. They're not going for it.
Well, who are the people who are demanding this austerity? Let's take one example. Let's take the case of Peter G. Peterson.
Pete Peterson.
Pete Peterson, yes. A real stuffed shirt. Okay. Now, Pete Peterson comes out of the University of Chicago, which is as fascist as it gets. The Chicago School is fascist economics.
That was what was the basis for what happened in Chile with Pinochet, right? The Chicago Boys, this whole method.
Milton Friedman in his defense of the drug trade. Complete free enterprise. We can do whatever we want, and you don't have anything to say about it. All right. Now, he was picked up by Lazard and put in as the head of a company called Bell and Howell, which, no big deal. But back then, this was when movie projectors were the big thing. So it was sort of a media company in a sense, right? All right. Then he was picked up by George Shultz to work in the Nixon administration to head the team writing the justification for taking the dollar off of gold. All right. When Pete Peterson was in Washington, his blind trust was administered by Felix Rohatyn of Lazard. All right. So this is a Felix Rohatyn boy. And since Felix Rohatyn is a fascist, it should be no surprise that Pete Peterson is a fascist. All right, so Peterson was there. I mean, he didn't do it. He was just one of the figureheads there to do it. I mean, he was never so important that he actually was the guy who did something. He was just a flunky as part of the process. All right, then after he got through in Washington, he went to Lehman Brothers, where he was brought in by George Ball, Mr. World Company. All right. Then he was at Lehman Brothers for a while. He was finally pushed out as the goal of the Inter Alpha Group to create these markets and to create the traders, people who were involved in securities trading as the big power on Wall Street, which is what they did. Then he was then eased out of Lehman Brothers and went off to found Blackstone Group. All right. But he has always been a creature of the Inter Alpha Group, basically. And, when Blackstone went public, one of the people on its board was Lord Jacob Rothschild, the guy who runs the Inter Alpha Group. So this tells you what the Blackstone Group is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Pete Peterson, the guy who's now this billionaire who's telling us and funding all of these operations, the IOUSA, all of these operations to tell us we're spending too much money. He's just a parasite. And he got rich by being a whore for the Inter Alpha Group. So instead of listening to him, we ought to throw him in jail.
Yeah.
You should take what he says as a confession and act accordingly. These guys, if you investigate them at all, you start running into crime after crime. So it's never any problem to find the things you can throw them in jail for. You just have to have the political will to go after them. But that's an example of how this works. And so, the billionaires who are telling us we're spending too much. We have the bailout. We have unlimited. The federal government has written a blank check for the bailout. It's warping the whole economy. The central banks are warping the whole world, in order to continue to fund the bailout of their system. Because without taxpayer money, that system would have collapsed, 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. So the only thing keeping it alive is taxpayer money, and they're sucking money out of nation states at an astonishing rate. And then they turn around and they tell the nation states, you guys are you're not fiscally responsible.
Right.
You're spending too much money. So, what do we have here? Cut your Social Security. We can't afford it. We need that money for our bailout. Mm-hmm. You're spending too much money on education. We can't afford health care. We can't afford police departments. We can't afford fire departments. We can't afford to pick up your trash. You people need to take your own trash to the dump. You want water? Dig a well. We can't afford you. It's our money. We need it. Mm-hmm. That's really what they're saying. And this comes straight from the top, from this tiny percentage of the American population, which is super rich, which is part of this British imperial system, and which is determined to protect it. Mm-hmm. Because they're not independent of Britain. This is the British Empire at work. And elements of this empire, it's an empire which is worldwide, that there are elements of it which are located in the United States, that this Venetian parasite is all over the place. And they're the ones telling us that we have to cut back. Mm-hmm. They want to take us back to third world living standards, just like they've suppressed the nations of Ibero-America, and just look at what they've done to Africa. Yep. And that's what they're trying to do to us. And this is deliberate. Mm-hmm. This is genocide. They've said, Prince Philip has said, 2 billion people in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. This is what the Inner Alpha Group is designed to do. You have a plan which you destroy the industrial base of the United States. So you're not producing anything anymore. You're not creating wealth anymore. Right? In order to make up for that, you start creating all these financial games where the people who are rich can get richer and richer. Mm. And the people who are not rich, well, they just sort of drop off the edge, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, look at the tax codes. The tax codes are all designed so that if you have money, it's easy to make more money. That the taxes are paid by people who work for a living and not by people who live off their investment incomes. Mm-hmm. The whole thing is structured to be unequal. And so then this thing, the bubble, the casino gets bigger and bigger while the economy underneath it collapses further and further.
Well, as part of that, as part of the building up of the bubble, because you did used to have the case in this nation where if you were, the now fabled middle class, and you were looking toward sending your children to college or buying a home in which to live, these kinds of things, that there were ways in which you could safely invest in order to have these kinds of things. For example, into the water and power and general public utilities were low-risk investments, bonds, these kinds of things. That at the time where, like, for example, the idea behind a 30-year bond, right, is that at the end of that, you would have a nice, safe investment such that you could rely on that to then determine your future, determine how you're going to live later on. Where when you had these things taken down, for example, one thing I remember when I was younger was the savings and loan crisis, which was a big deal. And these kinds of and then what you had with the Enron method of economy, if you want to call it that, swindle, crime, which has become regular economy today, everything that was stable within our economy has been taken away, such that anybody who is looking toward the future has no choice but to, if you're thinking, okay, you're in your 20s or 30s, some 5-10 years ago, and you're thinking, well, okay, where do I want to be 20 years from now? So what other opportunity do you have other than joining in this casino economy, where it seems that the situation was created that the only option for people to try and act on a future that they had in their imagination was to get involved with this casino economy. That became the general norm for society.
Yeah, which, I mean, this is what the Inner Alpha Group created. Right?
Yeah.
That the idea is that you take away stability and then you sell insurance, the derivatives market.
To insure against the risk.
To insure against the risk. Now, you know, it's a variation of the old mafia extortion racket. You know, where you go to a business in the middle of the night, you throw a brick through their window, and then you send your goon in the next day and say, you know, if you'll come up with a little bit every week, we'll protect your windows. This won't happen again. You know, so you kill world trade when you do this, except for ordinary people and ordinary companies. Because how do you, let's say you want to build a plant to produce something for exports, right? But with if the currency is stable, then you can say, okay, if I sell this product, I can make a product here. I can sell it in Mexico, and I can get enough pesos in Mexico to make it worth my dollar costs here. Mm-hmm. Or I can build a plant in Mexico. I know it's going to cost me so many pesos to build that plant, but I know what that's going to cost me in dollars because the exchange rates are stable. Mm-hmm. Because in the best of all worlds, they're fixed.
Yeah.
All right. Now you take away that stability. Okay, suddenly you have no idea, no guarantee, no confidence that those exchange rates are going to stay the same for the duration of your project. So you may build a plant there and then turn out that you can't possibly sell your product at a high enough price to cover the cost. Mm-hmm. Or you can't pay for it. You can't pay to build your plant because the currency rates change too much. Mm-hmm. Right? Well, that's not a problem because Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan or any one of a number of others will sell you derivatives. And they'll say if the currency rates move against you, well, you could buy insurance on that. You know, so yeah, we'll manipulate the currencies to make them unstable, and then we'll sell you the insurance to protect yourself. Now, if they weren't manipulating the currencies, there would be no need for the insurance. Right. So this is the mafia racket. Mm-hmm. This is the essence of the modern derivatives market. Mm-hmm. And then you get into offshoots like the S&Ls you mentioned. The S&Ls were taken down because they worked, because they provided stable funding for mortgages. So that system was systematically destroyed. The big banks gobbled up the best parts of it. Other parts of it were left to collapse. And that paved the way for the modern mortgage-backed securities market. Now, the mortgage-backed securities market, like the derivatives market in general, is a marvel of modern finance because you're essentially creating something out of nothing. It's the biggest scam you can imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, people thought Milken's junk bonds were a scam, mm-hmm. and they were. Mm-hmm. You know, and Milken went to jail.
Yeah.
But what the derivatives market has done makes Milken, look like a beginner. Because this is the process, right? You start off small,
yeah,
and then you just keep getting wilder and wilder and wilder.
Yeah, with today's authorities, Milken would actually probably win an economic prize for.
Well, yeah, he was
lauded. Being thrown in jail.
He was lauded for his work, and even though he was thrown in jail, he was allowed to keep $500 million. So he got his reward. But since Drexel, Burnham, Lambert, and Milken were part of our friends, the Inner Alpha Group, right? Because there's an official side, these individual banks, and then there's this hidden side of it, which is largely operating, around the world, but a lot of it inside the United States. things that you don't necessarily associate with the inner alpha group, like Drexel Burnham, like Lazard, like Blackstone, like J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs. You know, these things. They're all the familiar names. They're part of this global apparatus. And so they come in and they set up this system where they make everything chaotic, and then they sell the insurance. All right. Then you want to have this creation. You need more money for the machine. So what do? You said, okay, well, let's run up real estate prices. Let's use all the quote-unquote value that we create by running up real estate prices and use that as the basis for derivative speculation. All right? So you create value, quote-unquote, out of thin air by running up real estate prices artificially. All right? By the mortgage-backed security. So you take all these mortgages and you pool them together. And then you issue a derivative, a mortgage-backed security, based upon that pool of mortgages. Except that it's not really based on that pool of mortgages. That's a polite little fiction to make it sound good. Right?
Make it seem legitimate.
Yeah. And then you take the mortgage-backed security and you create other derivatives off of that. Then you create other derivatives off of those. You know, and then you create credit default swaps to protect you in case these derivatives go bad. Now, the credit default swaps are not ever intended really to pay off if the derivatives go bad, because you're building a pyramid scheme. The purpose of the credit default swap is to allow the rating agencies to give the securities you're creating a AAA rating so that you can sell them to suckers.
Again, make them seem legitimate.
Yeah, like your pension funds and things like that. So this whole thing is just an elaborate scam.
Yeah.
All right. Now, when the markets collapsed in the summer of 2007, what collapsed was this mortgage-backed securities-related derivatives machine. That's where the system blew up. But it wasn't a subprime crisis. The subprime crisis was the loosening of terms in order to keep the money flowing to feed the derivatives machine. All right, so it blows up. Suddenly, all of the insiders quit playing the game. They want out. They don't want to buy more of these securities. They want out. All right. This leads to the crisis in March of 2008, where Bear Stearns went under and was picked up with a nice little bailout by J.P. Morgan Chase. And then the big collapse, which occurred in September 2008, when the whole system ground to a halt. The whole system was going under, just like Lyndon LaRouche said it was going to.
Yeah.